Good evening, this is Mr. Wintermelon. In this lesson, you will learn how variation in individual leads to them having different chance of surviving in the nature world, and how this natural selection of them can lead to evolution. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to state that there are variation in individual which will lead to the survival and reproduction of organisms that are most adapted to their environment. The best fitted here simply means most adapted. Then give examples of environmental factors that acts as forces of natural selection. This is a fancy way of saying selection pressure. Then explain the role of natural selection as a possible mechanism for evolution. But first, let us take a look at some questions which creationists might ask. If evolution is true, why are there still monkeys in the zoo? Firstly, I know that this picture is a photo of a chimpanzee, but many people who doubt the theory of evolution doesn't know the difference between chimpanzee and monkey. So we will attempt to answer this question in the next few slides. Then they might also ask, when did the first human appear if everyone was not created at the same time? If you understand how evolution works, you should understand that there were no first human. But first, what is the definition of evolution? Evolution is a change in the heritable characteristic of a biological population over successive generations. These characteristics are the expression of genes that are passed on from parents to the offspring during reproduction. So there are two main things for you to take note. The characteristic must be heritable. So only gene can pass on the heritable characteristic. For example, if you cut your middle finger away, it doesn't mean that your child will be born without a middle finger, because not having a middle finger that you cut away is not a heritable trait. The second thing to take note is it must be over successive generation for evolution to occur. So the example that I have down here is the evolution of bear. So the ancestor of polar bear actually gains the gene that give it a white fur. The white is in open and closed inverted comma because their fur is actually transparent, but let's just stick with white. So after one of the ancestor of the polar bear gains the gene that give it a white fur, all its descendant will have white fur, while brown bear will continue to have brown fur and black bear will continue to have their black fur. The fur color is a heritable trait that are passed on over successive generation. And it is the process of evolution that gives rise to different species. Now, one important question that you should ask yourself is, what is the definition of a species? Why do we classify cats and dogs as different species, but one breed of dog, for example Saint Bernard, is the same species as a small little Chihuahua? Why do we consider different breed of dog as the same species, but dogs and cats, they are different species? The definition of species is more of an extra information, so you don't really have to copy down whatever is in this slide. But why am I going through this is so that you have a better understanding of what we are talking about. So a species is often defined as the largest group of organisms in which any two individuals of the appropriate sexes or mating type can produce fertile offspring, typically by sexual reproduction in the wild. So this may seem like a fancy way of saying two different genders can copulate, then they are equal to the same species. Two species which cannot copulate, then they are different species. But you have to take note of the keyword down here. One is produce fertile offspring and the other is in the wild. These two conditions must be fulfilled. For example, a donkey plus a horse will give you a male, but a male is infertile. That means it is unable to produce any offspring. Which is why a donkey and a horse, they are two different species, even though they can copulate. The other important thing is in the wild. In the zoo, you can produce a liger from tiger and lion, but in the wild, they probably wouldn't mate with each other. So they are considered different species. But just take note, this definition of species, right, is not a very good one. And you will see why, because of how evolution works. And in the case of organisms that reproduce asexually, every individual can be classified as different species. But we do not do that. So the term species itself is not well defined, if you ask me. And that is because of how evolution works. And you will see why later on. But back to the topic of donkey and a horse. Okay, we know that they are unable to produce fertile offspring. But why are they unable to produce fertile offspring? They look rather similar, don't they? So to understand what is going on, let us take a look at the phylogenetic tree of horse, donkey, and zebra. So you can see that donkey and zebra, they actually have a common ancestor. So you can see that a horse, a donkey, and a zebra, they actually have a common ancestor, while a donkey and a zebra have a more recent common ancestor. This is very similar to your family tree. You and your first cousin share the same grandparents. So your grandparents is a common ancestor for both you and your first cousin, while you, your first cousin, and your second cousin share a more distant common ancestor, which is your great-grandparents. So this is similar to zebra, donkey, and horses. But what is the big difference here? You and your first cousin, both of you can copulate and give birth to a fertile offspring. Not exactly recommended though, even though it's not illegal in Singapore. You and your second cousin can also copulate and give birth to a fertile offspring. So how come the cross between a horse and a donkey is unable to give rise to a fertile offspring? The main difference between these two family trees is one have many generations in between, while for your family tree, there's only one generation in between. Your parents and your uncles, they are the one generation separating both you and your first cousin from your grandparents. So what occurs in these many generations that leads to the classification of horse and donkey as two separate species? You can actually instantaneously create two new species. Let us take a look at our dogs. So dogs comes in many different sizes, but they are considered to be one species. But let us pause for a moment and think. Can a small little Chihuahua mate with a Great Dane? So just use a bit of your imagination and you should be able to see that there are some physical constraints if you want to make a large dog and a small dog. They cannot even get it off. But how come all the dogs are considered one species? That is because they are still able to interbreed with one another. So what does interbreed means? Interbreed means that the small dog can... Interbreed just means that the extra small dog can mate with the small dog can mate with the medium dog can mate with the large can mate with the extra large dog, and the extra large dog can mate with the extra large dog. So it's a far stretch, but their gene pool can still be mixed around, so they are still considered one species. the extra large dog and the extra small dog are considered one species because of the existence of intermediate. Now, I can immediately create two new species, and that is by killing off all the intermediate sized dog. So once the intermediate sized dog are killed off, you are left with two population of dogs that are unable to interbreed because of some physical constraint, which you probably don't want to imagine. So this is also why the definition of species is not exactly a good one, because species occurs only when intermediate are killed off or died out or become extinct. So back to the donkey and the horse. Why horse, donkey, and zebra are considered different species is simply because all the intermediate had died off. And due to some reason that we are going to go through later on, their genes are unable to be mixed together to produce a fertile offspring anymore. And since we are on this slide, we can answer the question as to why are there still chimpanzees in the zoo? There are chimpanzees in the zoo simply because we are not evolved from chimpanzee. Chimpanzees are like our cousin. We share a common ancestor, and that's about it. If you understand how evolution works, you wouldn't say those kind of stupid questions, because why would you evolve from your cousin? So back to the horse and the donkey. As I have mentioned earlier on, and as I have pointed out, something occurs which causes fusion of their gametes to produce infertile offspring. So what event caused that to happen? So what occurs is known as reproductive isolation. Since species became different species when they are unable to interbreed naturally due to reproductive isolation. So there are actually two types of isolation. It can be geographical isolation. That means the population are separated geographically, as well as biological isolation. We will see some example of biological isolation later on. But just keep in mind that only biological isolation has a genetic component in it, and it is likely to permanently separate interbreeding population. That means only when biological isolation occurs, then it's more likely to produce two different species. But a disclaimer, your O-level like to focus on geographical isolation instead of biological isolation. So just keep that in mind. So population can be separated geographically for many reasons. For example, formation of lakes, migration to different areas, continental drift or earthquake which separate populations. So you can see that the earth used to be one big mass, then the continent shift around, and we have the earth today. Then there was also disappearing of land bridges, such as the land bridge between Russia and North America or Alaska. This will cause population to be geographically separated. So different environment experienced by different subpopulation due to geographical separation can lead to biological isolation. So what are some biological isolation? There are actually two main forms of biological isolation. First is the pre-Gamatic isolation mechanism. And again, let me just emphasize, this is extra information. You don't really have to copy this down. So pre-Gamatic isolation, pre-gamete, that means before gamete. Sperm and egg doesn't even meet. For example, the male and female are not attracted to each other. But of course, one of the bird is kind of attracted to another, but not for reproduction reason. Or different gender cannot physically mate. For example, elephant you can't mate it with a mouse. And this will kind of apply to extra large dog and extra small dog, which is why the existence of dog as one species kind of make the definition of species not a very good one. Then there's also post-Gamatic isolation, whereby the sperm and the egg meet, but cells fail to form a zygote fail to produce viable offspring, or zygote fail to produce fertile offspring, in the case of a cross between a donkey and a horse. So again, the mechanism behind biological isolation is extra info. Don't have to copy this down. Same species can interpret as their gene pool are similar enough to be mixed. When gene pools get isolated, changes in their gene pool can cause them to no longer be able to be mixed. So when two gene pools get isolated, the changes over many generations might be too drastic until they can no longer be mixed with another species with the same common ancestor. And why is this the case? Let us look at the chiograph of donkey and a horse. Now, do a quick count of the number of pairs of chromosomes that a donkey has and the number of pairs of chromosomes that a horse has. You will see that a donkey has 31 pairs of chromosomes inclusive of the X and Y, while for horse they have 32. So this difference in the number of chromosomes can easily cause problems during mitosis and meiosis. And this is not just an isolated incident. If you look at the chimpanzee chromosomes, you will notice that they have 24 pairs compared to human 23 pairs. So for the offspring of a donkey and a horse, they will have 63 chromosomes. And if 63 is kind of diploid, which is kind of weird because diploid must be an even number. After meiosis, the 4 daughter cells will not have equal number of chromosomes. And the difference in number of chromosomes is not the only problem. Even when the number of chromosomes is the same, there will be other problems as well. Because during cell division, homologous chromosomes have to be aligned. And if you are talking about two different species, their chromosome 1 might be very different from each other. So in the end, the cell might have problems separating the chromosome equally, and the daughter cell might end up having dissimilar genetic. So changes in the number of chromosome or structure of chromosome will be inherited if it occurs in the gamete cell. So changes in the number of chromosome or the structure of chromosome will be inheritable if it occurs in the gametic cell. So these small differences in structure and number of chromosomes will add up. And when the changes became large enough, the gene pool will not be able to be mixed anymore, and we get two different populations. And since we are talking about changes, let us move on to variation. Now, let us take a look at these two Pikachu. Which one is cuter? So you can't really select either of them. Now, if we compare these two Pikachu, then you are able to make a choice. Do you like the fatter Pikachu or do you like the slimmer Pikachu? So there must be variation for meaningful selection to take place. So we have learned 3 events that leads to unique individual, which varies from their parents and siblings. They are crossing over during prophase 1, independent assortment of chromosome during metaphase 1, and fertilization. Another event that can lead to variation is mutation to the gamete cell. Like for example, let's say I have a mutation to my finger, I wouldn't pass this mutation to my offspring because hand is hand and hand doesn't go into the vagina. Maybe it does, but anyway, the mutation must be to the gamete cell for the change to be inheritable. So for mutation, it can be harmful or beneficial. When an offspring gains a beneficial mutation, which results in beneficial traits, it is more likely to survive and pass on more copy of this allele. For example, antibiotic resistance. You can take a look at this video from Harvard. It is very interesting. But just take note, a beneficial mutation can be harmful in different or new environment. So please do not think that all mutation is good or one mutation is bad over here, but the same mutation can be useful elsewhere. It all depends on the environment as well as the sex preference of the opposite gender, I guess. So when we have variation and mutation which cause variation, then there can be natural selection. So factors which influence the chance of whether a set of genes is passed on is known as selection pressure. But just take note, surviving alone is not enough to ensure that the genes are passed on. The organism must also be able to mate and reproduce. Hence, there is natural selection and sexual selection. But since sexual selection is done by the opposite gender in the nature world, I will kind of consider sexual selection as a subset of natural selection because it still happens in, nature. So there are many forms of selection pressure, for example, predators, parasite, competition of same species for food, toxin or disease, change in habitat or climate. So all of these will have an effect on which individual will survive because there are variation in individual. And those that survive will have the chance to attract opposite sex, while the opposite sex will have a mating preference. So mating preference and the ability to attract opposite sex are also considered selection pressure, but those are in the form of sexual selection pressure. So to make natural selection easy to understand, creatures that are more adapted to their environment will be able to find food or not get eaten. So can you see the chameleon? Can you see the stick insect? And the lizard that looks like a leaf? And it's not just trees and leaves that the animal can mimic. It can also mimic itself as a bird poo. And this camouflage is not just restricted to insects. Even birds will try to blend in. And if we take a look at this slug, it is actually the underside of the slug. If we turn it around, you can see that the top of the slug actually looks like the molted skin of a tarantula. So this adaptability will increase the chance of them not getting eaten. Different individuals will have different ability to mimic. So those that are not so good at hiding will not be able to pass on their not so good at hiding genes. So beside environment, those that are better at attracting mates will be able to pass on their desirable traits or gene to their offspring. Those unable to do so will not pass on their set of gene to the offspring. And changes in the environment or migration can cause different traits to become advantageous or disadvantageous in population that got isolated. So let us look at a case study of finches that got separated from its mainland counterpart. So in the island of Galapagos, once upon a time, a group of finches got stranded on the island. But as the island do not have any natural predators, the finches multiply, and plenty of food helps them as well. So in the beginning, all was good. There were plenty of food to go around, and all the birds were happy because enough food to eat, yay. And when there's enough food to eat, what do you think the birds will do? They will copulate and reproduce. When the population of finches increase, the increase in supply cannot keep up with the increase in demand. So selection pressure will become very strong, which will drive and help quicken evolution. So individual, even though they are similar, there are still subtle or little difference. So if you take a look at these two finches, you can see that their beaks are slightly different. So those that are more adapted to catching worm will spend most of their time catching worm, and those with beaks that are better at eating fruit, they will spend most of their time foraging food or looking for fruits that are in the tree or on the ground. So as the worm-eating finches spend more time with each other, eating worm on the ground, the chance of them mating with another bird that spend most of their time eating worm is higher. While for those that spend most of their time eating fruits, will encounter other finches that spend most of their time eating fruits. So this will increase the chance of those eating fruits to copulate with each other. So these biological niches are important to ensure that not all birds fight over the same food. Different birds will look for different food which they are better at hunting or eating. And for birds that are not as specialized, they might find themselves to be outcompeted by those specialized birds, and they might eventually die. So over the course of generation, the finches will evolve very differently from one another, until eventually, when they see each other, they become no longer attracted to each other, and they are only attracted to individual in their own niche. So this is how evolution leads to new species. Now, some of you might find it difficult to accept that both of the bird that look so different actually have a common ancestor. That means originally their ancestor looks about the same, but after many generations, they look completely different from one another. Like for example, you compare to cockroach. Both of you share a common ancestor, but both of you just look very different. Don't worry, I have one good analogy for you that you can observe within your lifetime. So ask yourself this, are these two persons the same person? They look very different. One is like a baby, one is like a near adult. So these two happen to be the same person, just that they are 20 years apart. What do I mean? So this is the baby when she was 0 years old, and the father took a video of her every week and compiled it into a video. So you can see her slowly evolving into an adult. This is very similar to how evolution works. So from 0 years old to 20 years old, if we line up her yearly photo, we can sort of tell the subtle difference between each year. Meaning we can sort of put them in sequence. But if I take the weekly video when she was 10, you would not be able to tell me which one come earlier and which one come later. And this is exactly how evolution works. One generation is no different from the next generation, and the next generation is no different from the next generation. You are a human. Your father is a human. The change is very small. Your grandfather is also a human. Your great-great-grandfather is also a human. So at any one point of a family tree from, let's say, a bacteria to a human, one individual is the same species as the generation before and the generation after. One generation is the same species as the generation before and the generation after. The change is very subtle, but as you accumulate all the generation together, you will be able to see the subtle change, generation by generation. So like the baby, the features gradually change. Just that you must take note, it is not only 6 generations. It is more than that. So the evolution of birds shown here is just like the yearly photo of the baby. There are many weekly photos which I do not have space to share, and there are many intermediate which I do not have space on the slide to show. From generation to generation, the change is very subtle, but the change will only become apparent when you put photos of generation that are very far apart. So, to answer the second question that we have at the start, when did the first human appear if everyone was not created at the same time? If we line up humans side by side, one generation is the same species as the generation before and the generation after. Just like we cannot tell which of the weekly photo come first. It is only when we align the yearly photo, then we can kind of tell which photo come first. And this yearly photo is just like our fossil record. But to be honest, our fossil record might be even worse. So our fossil record is not a generation by generation sort of collection. It is a collection whereby one piece of fossil might be thousands or millions of years away from the next in line. And maybe it's because of this lack of intermediate which allow us to classify different species, or else everything will belong to the same species. So in summary, evolution is the change in the heritable characteristic of biological populations over successive generations. Crossing over independent assortment, fertilization, and mutation will result in variation. And because of this variation, competition and selection pressure plus genetic isolation can lead to evolution of new species, but this is when all the intermediate has died off. Lastly, let us talk about sexual selection. Sexual selection, like I said, is part of natural selection whereby the opposite gender does the selection for the desirable trait instead of the environment doing the selection. This might lead to selection of traits that seems to be undesirable, like the peacock tail. It only attracts attention, like from your predators. But what to do? The female like it. So what to do? Only peacocks with more attractive tail feathers can attract female mate and pass on their attractive tail feather genes to their offspring. And that will be all for this lesson.